bar. In a storm-lashed district of Yisai, the bar was full of veterans. They had come because the word had spread, the Bashar is alive. The Bashar is calling, and for men who had served under Miles Teg, no other summons was necessary. They were older now, the scars of Rendatai and Serbol, and a dozen minor campaigns written on their bodies. The Honored Matres had been hunting Teg for a century, a long vendetta that spoke to how much they feared what he represented. He stood at the bar. His hand had been bandaged by a waiter who had recognized him and refused payment. "You saved my boy at Ackline. He lives because you ordered the medics to go in." "I have not forgotten." Now the waiter stood at the door, Alaskan held low, watching the street. Teg's doubled vision showed him the positions of every person in the room who was armed, who was drunk, who was watching the wrong door. It also showed him the gaps where no ships would be in orbit, the blind spots in the scanning grid. "I need a no ship," he said to the room. "Honored Matre design." From the scattering, "There's a maintenance yard on the high ridge above Yisai. I can see the path to it. We'll need pilots, ground security, and someone who knows the activation codes." An old soldier with a mechanical arm laughed. "Just like that, Bashar? Walk in and take a no ship?" "Yes." "Against how many?" 12 guards in the yard, another 20 in the barracks, 4 honored matres in the command tower. They'll be dead before they know we're there." The room went silent. The veterans were not cowards, but they were old. They knew the odds. Teg smiled. The smile of a commander who had never lost a battle he chose to fight. "I'll go first. You follow. That's all I ask." An hour later, the no-ship was his. The assault was not a battle. It was a demonstration. He moved through the maintenance yard at the speed the T-robe had given him, and the guards fell without seeing his face, without hearing his footsteps. The old soldiers coming behind him found a compound already pacified. They took the no-ship, powered up its systems, and lifted off before the Hore's backup forces could respond. From the cockpit, Teg looked down at Gamu, the planet that had been Giadi Prime, where Harkonnen cruelty had been refined over centuries, where he had trained the 12th Duncan Idaho Gola. He was leaving it behind. He would not return. Set course for Rakis. The pilot looked at him. "Rakis? The Honored Matres have the orbital approaches locked down. We'll be blown out of the sky before we hit atmosphere. I know a way through," Teg said. His doubled vision was showing him the gaps in the Honored Matre grid, the blind spots where scanners would not reach. He thought of Patron, his old aide, who had sacrificed himself as a decoy, of Shfang Yu, dead at the hands of the horde she had tried to ally with, of Taraza, who had set this entire chain of events in motion and who, he suspected, was no longer alive. "Rakus," he repeated. "Sheeana will arrive riding on the back of a worm. I intend to be there when she does." The farewell. The no-ship landed in the desert 40 kilometers from Keen, hidden behind a rock formation that dated from the famine times. Teg deployed armored vehicles and sent scouts into the city. What they found confirmed his doubled vision's warnings. The Honored Matres had taken Rakus. Not completely. The priesthood still held the temple complex, and the Bene Gesserit compound was fortified, but the city's infrastructure was under enemy control. A full-scale assault was being prepared. "Taraza is dead," Teg told Lucilla when she arrived at the no-ship. "They killed her in a Thopter attack." She transferred her memories to Odrade before she died. Odrade is the Mother Superior now. The imprinter absorbed this without visible reaction. She had performed the transfer twice herself, for dying sisters. She knew what it meant. Odrade will be at the rendezvous point. The pump room access shaft leads to the desert wall, and from there to the old spice yard. "Shall bring Sheeana." "And the worm." "The worm?" "The one from Sietch Tabra. The last worm, the Tyrant's legacy, shall arrive at sunset." Lucilla frowned. "You can see I don't have time to explain. When Odrade arrives, you'll take the no-ship and leave. Go to Chapterhouse. Don't stop for anything. The diversion will buy you 4 hours, maybe less. You'll need to be out of the Rocky system before the Honored Matres realize they've been tricked." "What diversion?" "Me." She stared at him. Teg was 73 years old. He had commanded armies, trained Golas, endured a T-probe, killed 53 people in a compound on Gamu, and captured a no-ship with a dozen aging veterans. He looked tired. He also looked like a man who had finally understood his purpose. "They'll sterilize the planet," he said. "When they realize what we've done, they'll burn Rakus to ash. But the worm will be gone. The Tyrant's pearl of awareness, his prescience, his hold on humanity's future, it's all encoded in the worm. If the hordes destroy Rockies with the worm still on it, the tyrant wins. His vision locks into place. But if the worm is gone, if it's somewhere they can't find it, then the future opens again. You'll die, she said, probably. Patron died. Xuanyu died. Terraza died. Now you. How many of us have to? All of us, Teg said. Everyone who carries the tyrant's mark. Everyone who was bred for this. The Sisterhood has been trying to escape Leto's design for 3,500 years. He planned for that. He planned for everything. But he didn't plan for what the T-probe did to me. At sunset, O'Drady came walking out of the desert. Sheeana was at her side, the girl's face set in an expression of furious concentration. Behind them, visible against the darkening sky, a worm rose from the sand 40 meters long, its body moving in the rhythm of the Rakian dance that Sheeana had learned to speak. O'Drady reached the no-ship. She looked at Teg. He saw Terraza's memories in her eyes. Terraza's design, she said, destroy most of the worms, break the tyrant's oracular hold. She was right. But this worm is different. The one that came to Ch Tabra, the one that showed me the tyrant's message, it knows what it is. It knows what it carries. Take it, Teg said. Take the worm, take Sheeana, take the Gola. She's in the hold. Go to Chapterhouse. You're Mother Superior now. Terraza's plan is yours to finish. O'Drady's face was wet. You're my father. Yes. Then come with us. I can't. The diversion requires me to be here. They need to see me, need to know I'm still fighting. If they think the Bashar is on Rakis, they'll throw everything they have at the planet. That gives you time. He leaned forward, kissed her cheek, and spoke so softly that only she could hear. Do what you must, daughter. O'Drady turned. She walked up the no-ship's ramp without looking back. Sheeana followed, and the worm sank into the sand, migrating, vanishing toward the cargo hold that the ship had prepared for it. The ramp closed. The no-ship lifted. Teg stood alone in the desert, an old man in a Bashar's uniform, and watched the ship become a speck, and then a star, and then nothing at all. He turned toward Keen. The Honored Matres would be coming soon. He would give them the fight they expected, and then Rakis would burn. But the worm was gone. The Gola was gone. The girl who spoke to worms was gone. The future was open. The language. Aboard the no-ship, in the hours after the escape from Rakis, O'Drady stood before the holding chamber where the worm had been housed. It was a younger worm, one of the Sandrout's offspring, born in the hidden melange cache the tyrant had left behind, but it carried the same imprint, the same pattern, the same language. Sheeana had explained it during the worm ride. Shaitan speaks through movement, through heat, through the way the sand shifts. It's not words, it's something older than words. When I danced on the sand for the priests, I wasn't commanding the worms. I was asking them, and they agreed. The Siainok language, the language of the tyrant's consciousness transferred into worm biology, was not a code to be cracked. It was a relationship to be entered. The worms carried fragments of Leto Aya's awareness, his prescience, his memory of 3,500 years as a god emperor, and 3,000 years more as a scattering of sand trout. They were the pearls of awareness he had spoken of, the legacy he had bequeathed to a humanity that had never asked for it. O'Drady placed her palm against the Plaz wall. The worm turned. Its mouth opened, a circular darkness ringed with crystalline teeth. She knew, in that moment, that it was aware of her. Not as a reverent mother, not as the Sisterhood's new leader, but as a living thing that shared its universe. We have your language now, she said aloud, not the words, the thing underneath the words. We know what you were trying to tell us. We know what you bequeathed. The worm settled. Not a response, not in any human sense, but an acknowledgement. The chamber's scanners registered a shift in the creature's metabolic rate, a slowing of its internal furnace. It was waiting. Duncan was waiting too. She found him in the observation lounge, his face turned toward the starfield. Marbella was in the medical bay, still unconscious, still bound to him by the pattern the Tleilaxu had planted. The imprinter was in her quarters, processing the loss of Teg, the survival of the Gola, the cascade of events that had transformed her mission. You said you would not breed for us, the new Mother Superior said. Terraza's plan required it, but Terraza is dead. I am reconsidering. Duncan did not turn. Reconsidering what? Whether we need to force you at all. The pattern the Tleilaxu gave you, the sexual weapon that overwhelmed the young honored matre, it's a bonding mechanism, not simple control. Actual bonding. Any honored matre who tries to use her hold on you will be captured instead. That makes you more valuable as a counterweapon than as a stud. Am I supposed to be grateful? No. You're supposed to understand that you're no longer just a Gola. You're a composite. All the previous Duncans, all the previous lives, they're in you now. You remember Caladan. You remember Paul. You remember dying for him. You also remember being grown in a tank by the Tleilaxu, and you remember the Sisterhood trading your cells back and forth for 3,500 years like a commodity. He turned. His eyes were ancient. What do you want from me? Odrade met his gaze. I want you to survive. We need you. The whores are coming not just to Rockies, but to Chapterhouse, to every world the Sisterhood holds. They've been preparing this for centuries. The scattering sent them back for a reason, and that reason is us. They want to destroy us, and they're willing to burn planets to do it. So, you want a weapon. I want you, she said. The man, not the Gola, the Duncan Idaho who served the Atreides, who stood with Paul against the Harkonnens, who knew what the Tyrant was and chose to stay. That man, that composite, is the only one who can teach us what the Honored Matres fear. And if I refuse, then you'll remain here, confined, safe, until we decide what to do with you. I won't force the breeding. I'm not sure it would work anymore anyway. You're too changed by the cascade. But I won't release you either. Taraza's memories are in me now. I know what she knew. I know the design she was building. And I know that you're the key. Not Sheeana, not the worm, you. Duncan was silent for a long moment. The starfield wheeled slowly past. Somewhere in the ship's hold, the worm shifted in its chamber, dreaming its slow, hot dreams of sand and eternity. Can you feel love? He asked. The question caught her off guard. I am a reverend mother. That's not an answer. She thought of Teg. Of his kiss on her cheek, his whisper, do what you must, daughter. Of the Van Gogh painting, cottages at Cordville, preserved by Ixians for millennia, a dark spot on the canvas that, when touched, replayed the painter's emotion. Of her foster mother Sibia, rocking silently in a chair while the Bene Gesserit money lay on the floor. Yes, she said, I can feel love. I was taught that it leads to misery, but I feel it. Then there's hope for you, Duncan said. Not much, but some. He turned back to the starfield. I'll consider your offer, not because I trust you, because whatever's coming, I want to be there when it arrives. She left him there, staring into the void. She had her answer. Not the answer she had wanted, but the answer she could use. In the hold, the worm breathed. And in the deep desert of Rakis, which was about to become a graveyard for a planet, the tyrant's pearls of awareness were already scattering into the sand, into the wind, into the silence that comes when an oracular hold is broken at last. The no-ship flew on. The Sisterhood had survived. At enormous cost, with enormous uncertainty, but they had survived. And somewhere ahead, invisible in the starfield, Chapterhouse waited. Episode 4. The Language of the Worm. The workroom on the no-ship was Taraza's, and Odrade had not changed it. The desk was the same slab of dark Axian composite, unadorned except for a single spool reader and the small bust of Sister Shinoe, the woman who had met the tyrant face to face 3,000 years ago and lived to record what she saw. The chair was the same hard-backed model every Bene Gesserit office used, designed to support the spine for long hours without fatigue, but never to encourage slouching. The air still carried the faint, sterile scent of sheer. Odrade sat in that chair now, and Taraza's memories sat in her skull, and the two facts were still in the process of becoming one. The transfer was complete. She knew that. The Bene Gesserit ritual of sharing forehead to temple, the cascade of a lifetime pouring across the synaptic bridge, had worked exactly as it was designed to work. Taraza's childhood on Chapterhouse, her training, her first assignments, her long climb through the Sisterhood cellular hierarchy, her encounters with Teg, her negotiations with Waff, her final desperate decision to go to Rockus in person, all of it was in Odrade now, coded into the same other memory that held her own past and the lives of 20,000 reverend mothers before her. But knowing was not the same as integrating. The memories arrived with emotional weight attached to Raza's fury at Belanda, her cold satisfaction when Waff revealed the honored matrix sexual hold, her private terror in the weeks before her death as she realized what the tyrant's message meant. These emotions did not belong to Odrade. They belonged to a dead woman, and yet they were in her now, demanding attention, demanding that she feel them again on Taraza's behalf. She closed her eyes and let one memory surface. Taraza in her Chapterhouse quarters, alone at night, the bust of Shinoe on the desk. The breeding projections scattered across the desktop, their implications grim. Belanda had been pressing for Odrade's execution, kill her, kill Vigola, cut our losses, and Taraza had felt the trap closing, not just Belanda's opposition, but the larger trap of history. The tyrant had been right. The Sisterhood had failed him, and now, 3,500 years later, the bill was coming due. Taraza had slammed her hand on the desk in that memory, startling herself with the violence of her own frustration. Odrade felt the impact in her palm. She opened her eyes. The present reasserted itself. The hum of the no ship's engines, the starfield visible through the narrow viewport. Taraza was dead. Teg was dead. Rakis was burning. The Sisterhood had survived. That was the only thing that mattered now. She reached for the reports stacked beside the spool reader, Belinda's latest transmission from Chapterhouse, relayed through a chain of couriers so convoluted that even the guild could not have traced it. The message was terse. Council will convene on your arrival. Questions Taraza's death and the Rockies operation. Belanda. Questions. Odrade knew what that meant. Belanda intended to challenge her authority. The faction that had supported Xuanyu, the conservatives who believed the Gola project was a mistake from the beginning, was still alive, still powerful, still waiting for the right moment to strike. With Taraza gone and Rakis destroyed, that moment was now. Let them challenge. Odrade had something Belanda did not have. She had Taraza's memories. She knew every argument Belanda had ever made, every weakness Belanda had ever revealed in council, every deal Belanda had ever struck behind closed doors. Taraza had been gathering intelligence on her own opposition for decades, and now that intelligence was in Odrade's head. More importantly, Odrade had Teg's legacy. She called up the file on the submolecular storage system, the last will and testament of Miles Teg. Basher, a document he had dictated in the final hours before the escape from Rockies, in the no-ship that had carried them to safety. The document was not long. Teg had never been a man of many words, but what it contained would shake the Sisterhood to its foundations. Teg had mapped out the mechanisms by which institutions, including the Bene Gesserit, controlled history, the destruction of inconvenient records, the burial of dissenting accounts under ridicule, the silencing of messengers who brought bad news, the deliberate cultivation of scapegoats. He had named names. He had cited specific archival manipulations that he himself had been ordered to carry out during his years of service. And because he had been a mentat, because his memory was flawless and his logic was irrefutable, none of it could be dismissed as error or exaggeration. The Sisterhood's historical records, the sacred foundation texts that every Reverend Mother studied, the carefully curated narrative of the tyrant's reign and the famine times and the scattering, were built on lies. Not accidental lies, deliberate, strategic lies, maintained over millennia by successive generations of archivists. Teg's testimony proved it. He had closed with a phrase she kept returning to, noble purpose, and Odrade intended to use it all. She would not destroy the Sisterhood. She was Mother Superior now. The Sisterhood was her responsibility, her body, her life. But she would change it. The archival orthodoxy that had allowed the conservatives to block every reform Taraza had proposed that was going to end. Teg's document would force a revision of the historical records, and that revision would open the door to changes that Xuangyu's faction had spent centuries preventing. She reached for another report, Sheeana's cell analysis conducted by the ship's medtechs during the flight from Rockies. The results were unambiguous. Sheeana carried the Siona gene. The girl was descended from the line of Siona, the Atreides woman who had been bred by the tyrant to be invisible to prescience. That was why Sheeana could command the worms. Not because she was holy, not because she was a prophet, because she was invisible to the tyrant's oracular awareness, and the worms which carried fragments of that awareness could not see her to predict her. The priests of Rockies had worshipped the wrong thing. They had knelt to a girl who was, in biological terms, a blind spot. Odrade filed the report. Sheeana would need to be told eventually, but not yet. The girl had lost her planet. Her priests were dead, her temple was ash. And the worms who had answered her call were dying in the sterilization fires that the Honored Matres were still raining down on Rakis. Let her grieve before she had to learn that her divinity was a genetic trick. 3 decisions crystallized as Odrade worked. First, Duncan. He would remain confined to the no ship. Not as a prisoner, his quarters were comfortable, his access to information was unrestricted, and Lucilla had been assigned to monitor his psychological state, but he would not be permitted to leave. The cascade of memories had transformed him. He now carried all 12 of his previous lives, plus the Tleilaxu implanted sexual technique that had overwhelmed Merbella. That combination made him too dangerous to release and too valuable to risk. The Honored Matres were hunting him. The Tleilaxu had done something to him that even Taraza had barely understood. Until Odrade knew the full extent of his capabilities, confinement was the only responsible option. Second, the worm. The creature in the cargo hold, the one born from the Mélange Cache at Ch Tabra, the one that had carried the Tyrant's pearls of awareness, was approaching metamorphosis. Its internal furnace had begun to cycle down, its rings were loosening. Within weeks, perhaps days, it would enter the sand-trout phase, dissolving into thousands of individual organisms that could transform a planetary ecology. Chapterhouse was the destination. The planet had no desert, no sandworms, no melange cycle. The worm's offspring would change that. They would create spice. They would create new worms. They would, in effect, transplant the Tyrant's legacy to a world where the Honored Matres could not reach it. Taraza had planned to destroy most of the worms on Rakis to break the oracular hold. That plan had succeeded, though not in the way Taraza had intended. The Honored Matres had done the destroying, but one worm had escaped. One worm carried the full pattern, and that worm was now Odrade's responsibility. Third, Teg's memory. She would commission a bust of him, a small sculpture in the Bene Gesserit tradition, to be placed in the Chapterhouse archives alongside Shinoa and the other figures the Sisterhood honored. The inscription would read, Miles Teg Bashar, the Great Heretic. It was a title Taraza had once used for him in private, half joking, half serious. Now it would be official. Teg had been a heretic to the old order, the archival orthodoxy, the conservative faction that had opposed the Gola project from the start. His testimony would make him the patron saint of the reform Odrade intended to carry out. Belanda would hate it. That was acceptable. Belanda had wanted Odrade killed. Let her choke on the bust. The confrontation. The observation lounge was quiet when Odrade entered, and the Gola Duncan stood at the viewport with his back to her, his silhouette cut sharp against the starfield. The lounge was designed for contemplation, soft lighting, comfortable chairs, a small table with water and dried fruit, but he had not touched the food. He had been standing in the same position for hours, according to the ship's monitors. Lucilla had reported that he was sleeping in fragments, 2 hours at a time, and that his dreams were violent. Odrade did not announce herself. She crossed the room and stood beside him, close enough to see his face reflected in the plas. The reflection was strange. His features were young, the body was barely past adolescence. The Tleilaxu modifications designed to accelerate growth without sacrificing health, but his eyes held the weight of 12 lives and 3,000 years. You've been reviewing Taraza's files, Duncan said. Not a question, yes. You move differently now, slower, heavier, like someone who's carrying more than her own weight. Odrade considered denying it, then chose not to. Taraza's memories are fully integrated. It takes time to adjust. Adjust. He turned from the viewport. His expression was unreadable, but there was something almost gentle in his tone. That's one word for it. Another word would be haunted. You look like a woman who's seen her own death from someone else's eyes. Have you? Many times. The first Duncan died on Giedi Prime, Sardaukar knives in his chest while he screamed for Paul to escape. The second tried to kill Paul on a hayliner and was killed in turn. Why? The third, the fourth, the fifth, all of them died in service to the Atreides, one way or another. I remember every death, every wound, every face I loved and lost. He paused. Yes, I've seen my own death, 12 times over. The cascade makes it hard to tell which one is really mine. Odrade absorbed this. His psychological state was uncharted territory. No one in the Sisterhood's history had ever recovered the full memory cascade from multiple Gola births. The Tleilaxu had known what they were doing, the sexual implant was proof of that, but even they had probably not anticipated the full scope of what Duncan had become. Taraza's design, she said. You asked about it before. I told you the outline destroy most of the worms, break the Tyrant's oracular hold, but there's more. She intended the destruction of Arrakis itself, not just the worms, the whole planet. His eyes widened slightly. The whole planet. The Tyrant's pearls of awareness were scattered too widely. Every worm, every grain of sand, every spice deposit, they all carried fragments of his prescient identity. As long as Arrakis existed, the oracular trap remained. The Honored Matres solved that problem. They'll sterilize the planet completely. Nothing will survive. No worms, no ecology, no possibility that the Tyrant's pattern could reassemble itself. And the worm in the hold? The exception, one worm carrying the full pattern, brought to a world the Honored Matres don't know about. Chapterhouse. The metamorphosis will create sand trout. The sand trout will create a new desert, a new spice cycle, new worms, a new Arrakis, in miniature, under our control. Teraza wanted to break the Tyrant's hold while preserving his legacy. This was her solution. Duncan was silent for a long moment. The starfield wheeled behind him. When he spoke, his voice was quiet. Retina, you want me to breed? I want you to help us. The Honored Matres are coming. They destroyed Arrakis. They're capable of destroying Chapterhouse next. They have weapons from the scattering we don't understand. They have sexual techniques that can enslave entire populations, and they have a grudge against the Sisterhood that goes back centuries. I don't know why. Teraza didn't know either, but I know they won't stop until we're dead. So you need a weapon. I need you, the man, not the Gola, the Duncan Idaho who served Paul Atreides, the Duncan Idaho who watched the Tyrant consume himself over 3,500 years and still chose to stay loyal. You know what the Honored Matres fear. You've been inside Mirbella's mind, the cascade of her conditioning, her training, her dependencies. You understand them in a way no Reverend Mother ever could. He turned back to the viewport. And if I refuse, then you remain confined, safe, comfortable, until circumstances change. I won't force the breeding. I told you that before, and I mean it. The Tleilaxu implant has changed the calculus. Mirbella is bonded to you now. Her honored matre conditioning is shattered. She's unconscious in the medical bay while our doctors try to stabilize her. When she wakes up, she'll be yours. That makes you more valuable as a counterweapon than as a stud. Mirbella. The name came out of him with a weight Odrade recognized. He remembered her. He remembered what she had done to him, what he had done to her in response. The cascade had bound them together in a way neither of them had chosen. Yes, Mirbella, she's not your enemy anymore. She's your, Odrade searched for the right word, your counterpart, your balance. The technique the Tleilaxu planted in you creates a reciprocal bond. She tried to enslave you. Now she's enslaved to you. Both of you are victims of a process neither of you consented to. Duncan made a sound that might have been a laugh. Victims. That's one word for it. The Sisterhood is full of victims. Every Reverend Mother has survived the spice agony. Every one of us has been trained, groomed, bred for purposes we didn't choose. You're not unique in that, Duncan. You're just more complicated. Complicated. He turned again, and this time his expression had shifted. Something harder, something older. You keep using words that don't mean what you want them to mean. Confined, comfortable, help. What you want is compliance. You want me to give you what the Tleilaxu gave me, and you want me to do it on your terms, for your purposes. End quote. I want you to survive, Odrade said, and I want the Sisterhood to survive. Those two things are not in conflict, aren't they? He stepped closer. His physical presence was unsettling. The body was young, but his posture, his movement, the way he held his weight, all belonged to a man who had fought and killed and died in a dozen different lifetimes. You told me Teraza's design. You told me what she planned for the worms, for Arrakis, for the Tyrant's legacy. What you haven't told me is what she planned for me. The breeding with Sheeana was part of it. The imprint Lucilla was supposed to perform was part of it. The trip to Arrakis was part of it. But what was the endgame? What was I supposed to become when all the pieces were in place? Odrade did not answer immediately. The question was fair. Teraza's files on the Gola project were extensive, but the final stages had always been contingent, dependent on Duncan's awakening, on Sheeana's development, on the political situation with the Tleilaxu and the Honored Matres. Teraza had been building the bridge as she crossed it. I don't know, she admitted. Teraza's memories are in me, but her plans were incomplete. She expected to live longer. She expected to have more time. The Thopter attack that killed her was not anticipated. Neither was Teg's transformation. Neither was the cascade that made you into, she gestured at him. Whatever you are now, whatever I am, his voice was flat. I'll tell you what I am. I'm the sum of everything the Sisterhood and the Tleilaxu and the Tyrant have been doing for 3,500 years. I'm a weapon, a tool, a commodity. They grew me in tanks. They traded my cells like currency. They killed 11 of me before this one, and they would have killed this one too if Shuang Yu had gotten her way. And now you're asking me to volunteer for the next stage of the operation? To help the same institution that bred me and sold me and tried to murder me? Yes, at least you're honest. Honesty is cheap when you have nothing left to lose. Taraza is dead, Teg is dead, Rakis is gone. The Honored Matres are coming. The Tleilaxu alliance is fragile. The face dancers are developing independent wills. Belanda wants me removed as Mother Superior. My position is weaker than you think. So yes, I'm honest. I have no choice but to be. Duncan studied her in silence. The starfield cast pale light across his face, deepening the shadows under his eyes. Can you feel love? He asked. The question landed harder than Odrade expected. She had answered it before, during their first conversation after the escape. But this time, the context was different. This time, she was Mother Superior. This time, she carried Taraza's death and Teg's sacrifice and the weight of the tyrant's accusation. I am a reverend mother, she said. That's still not an answer. She thought of Teg, his kiss on her cheek, his whispered, "Do what you must, daughter." The way he had stood alone in the desert, waiting for the Honored Matres to come, knowing that he would die and that his death would buy the Sisterhood 4 hours of survival. She thought of the Van Gogh painting. Cottages at Cordoville, preserved for millennia in null entropy storage, a dark spot on the canvas that, when touched, replayed the painter's moment of creation. She thought of her foster mother, Sibia, rocking silently in a chair while Bene Gesserit money lay on the floor, refusing to accept payment for a child she had loved. Yes, O'Drady said, I can feel love. I was taught that it leads to misery. And it does. Sibia's misery, Teg's death, Taraza's loneliness. Every attachment I've ever formed has been broken or burned. But I feel it anyway. I can't stop feeling it. And I don't want to. Duncan held her gaze for a long moment. Then he nodded, slowly, as though confirming something he had suspected all along. Then there's hope for you, he said. Not much, but some. He turned back to the viewport. The conversation was over. Odrade left him there, staring into the void. She had not gotten his agreement. She had not expected to. But she had gotten something else. A connection, fragile and tentative, built on shared honesty about what they had both lost. It was not enough to change anything, but it was a beginning. The word hope stayed with her as she descended through the ship. It felt foreign, a thing she had been trained to mistrust. But Duncan had said it, and Duncan had died 12 times and still chose to stand at a viewport rather than break the glass. She wanted to see the worm. She wanted to stand before the silent monster and understand what they had saved. The silent monster. The cargo hold was cold. The environmental systems had been adjusted to simulate desert night, the temperature the worm preferred, the humidity levels that kept its skin from cracking. In the dim light of the glow globes, the creature rested in its specially constructed chamber, a depression in the deck filled with sand from Rakis that the no-ship's crew had loaded before departure. The worm was 40 meters long, its body segmented in rings that rippled slowly in a rhythm too slow to track. Its mouth was closed, the crystalline teeth hidden behind layers of flexible membrane. It was, Odrade thought, the most alien thing she had ever seen, and yet it was also the most familiar. The tyrant was in there, not Leto Eye, as he had been in life, not the hybrid face, the stunted arms, the body that had slowly transformed over 3,500 years from human to worm to something beyond either category. Those fragments of awareness were scattered now, burned in the sterilization fires on Rakis, dispersed into ash and silence. But the pattern remained. The worm carried the tyrant's consciousness in its biology, the same pearl of awareness Leto had described, the same prescient identity that had allowed him to see and shape the future across millennia. As long as the worm lived, the tyrant lived, not as a person, not as a god, as a pattern, a language. Odrade had told Duncan the truth. The Sisterhood now understood that language. Sheeana had been the key, not the girl's power over the worms that was a side effect of her Siona genes, a biological quirk that the priests had mistaken for divinity but her dance. The Sienok rhythm, the long, patient movement sequence that the tyrant had taught his fish speakers 3,000 years ago, which had devolved on Rakis into a fossilized ritual of ecstatic release, and which Odrade had recognized in the Great Square of Keen as a hidden form of communication. The worms did not speak. They had no words, no vocal apparatus, no symbolic system that humans could decode, but they responded to movement, to heat, to the vibration of feet on sand. The Sienok dance was a vocabulary of those elements, a grammar of pressure and rhythm and stillness that the tyrant had encoded into his fish speakers and, through them, into the Rakian priesthood. The priests had forgotten what the dance meant. They performed it as worship, not as conversation. But the worms remembered. The worms had always known what they were being told. "We have your language now," Odrade said aloud. The worm did not respond. Its rippling continued, slow and steady. The metabolic scanners reported a gradual decline in its internal temperature, the first stage of the metamorphosis that would transform it into sand trout. Within days, the creature would dissolve. Thousands of individual organisms, each carrying a fragment of the pattern, would be released into the Chapterhouse ecosystem. They would seek water. They would seal it off. Within years, a new desert would begin to form. Within decades, a new spice cycle would begin. Within centuries, new worms would rise. The tyrant's legacy would continue, not on Rakis, not under the control of the priesthood, but on a world the Sisterhood controlled in a form the Honored Matres could not anticipate. It was not victory. Odrade was too tired, too grief-stricken, too weighed down by Terraza's memories to mistake survival for triumph. But the worm was in the hold. Duncan was on the ship. Sheeana was alive. Zionist genes confirmed, her future unknown but full of possibility. Merbella was bonded to Duncan, her honored matre conditioning broken, her knowledge of the enemy available for interrogation. Teg's testimony was in the submolecular storage, waiting to upend the archival orthodoxy, and Odrade herself was Mother Superior, carrying the full memory of everything Terraza had known, everything Terraza had planned, everything Terraza had feared. It was enough, barely, but it was enough. She placed her palm against the plaswall of the chamber. The worm sensed the pressure, or the heat of her hand, or something subtler, the Sienok rhythm of her pulse. Perhaps. Its rippling changed, slowed, matched her. Noble purpose, Odrade said. The word was Teg's, the phrase he had closed his testimony with, the one she kept returning to. He had been right. The Sisterhood's motives had never been pure. They had bred and manipulated and controlled for centuries, serving their own survival first and humanity's welfare second. The tyrant's accusation was true. They had failed him. They had failed themselves. They would probably fail again. But they had also saved the worm. They had also broken the oracular hold. They had also preserved the possibility of a future that was not predetermined by prescient awareness, not locked into the vision of a god-emperor who had sacrificed his humanity to save a species that did not want to be saved. Odrade removed her hand from the plaz. The worm's rippling returned to its original rhythm. She turned away from the chamber and walked out of the hold. The no ship flew on. The worm breathed in the darkness. And somewhere in the deep future, beyond the reach of any prescience, the tyrant's golden path continued to unspool, not as Leto had envisioned it, but as the living universe chose to make it. "We have your language now," Odrade had said. And it was true. There were no words in that language, only experience. The Sisterhood had survived. The story you just heard ends with Odrade standing before a captive worm and saying, "We have your language now." It is not a victory speech. It is the quiet acknowledgement of a strategist who has just lost her planet, her predecessor, her father, and the illusion that understanding can justify the cost of acquiring it. That discomfort is the point. Heretics of Dune was published in 1984, 3 years after God Emperor of Dune closed the original tetralogy with Leto-ist disillusion and the promise that his golden path would free humanity from prescient control. Heretics is the book where the bill for that promise comes due, and the bill is paid not by a hero, but by a depleted institution carrying its dead inside its memories. The novel opens 1,500 years after the tyrant's death. The payoff readers may have expected has already been deferred across geological time. Herbert knew what he was denying his audience. Where 12 years and 5 books, the Dune cycle had been building toward a resolution, a meaning that would make the suffering legible. Dat it. Heretics says no. The Bene Gesserit do have a plan worm metamorphosis, historical revision, continued breeding, but it is a plan measured in centuries, not chapters. Restoration is not absent. It is deferred beyond the lifespan of everyone in this story. The worm is not just a worm. It carries the tyrant's pearls of awareness, fragments of consciousness without words. That is why the language Odrade has finally learned has no words, only experience. The worm will take centuries to transform Chapterhouse into desert. By the time it matters, everyone you have just listened to will be dead. This is the Dune Cycle's thesis at its most austere. The most dangerous story a civilization can tell itself is the one where everything makes sense in the end, because the real universe does not offer sense, only consequence. The Dune Cycle had been promising for 5 books that humanity could be freed from oracular control. Heretics finally delivers that freedom, and it looks like a no-ship full of survivors, a captive monster, and a debt no one alive will see repaid. Understanding arrives too late to change the cost. The only thing you get to keep is the willingness to pay it anyway.